Hey everybody, this is another podcast for our flipped classroom session. This session on the Great Depression and the New Deal. We're going to have another role-playing assignment, and in this case we're going to have 4 different groups try to measure out or assess the extent to which the New Deal was truly new, or a raw deal, or just an old deal. Now, in this first slideshow, we're going to look at the causes of the Great Depression, or at least summarize them, because we looked at them in detail in the lecture on Monday, the same week as the flipped classroom session. And we want to get a sense of the final understanding of the causes of the Depression, how Hoover's program was new and innovative for its time, but too little and too late given the proportions of the Great Depression, which were so serious. And then we'll look at the changes that FDR brought to America. And, of course, in the role-playing assignment, you have to assess whether those changes were real or illusionary. And we'll look at the ways in which the New Deal was bold in style, but conservative in substance. And to the extent that it was conservative, it was old-fashioned. Not necessarily a raw deal, but not a new deal. And we'll also look at why a Great Depression like the one in the 1930s can never, ever happen again, as long as we continue to remember the lessons of the Great Depression. One can never say never, but as long as we remember the lessons of the Depression and keep the regulations that were put into place during the 1930s to prevent another depression, we probably will never experience another depression. Now remember, the causes of the Depression were low consumer purchasing power. So to the extent that the New Deal brought about a guarantee of consumer purchasing power, it can't repeat itself. We had an economy in the 1920s that was dependent on consumer spending. There was, of course, a banking crisis, and banks were extremely vulnerable to corruption and panics because some banks were ill-managed, and Americans could not tell the difference. So they would descend on the banks and demand their deposits back. And in an era before there was any kind of regulation of bank deposits or insurance of bank deposits, runs on banks could cause the collapse of the entire banking system. You also had corporate corruption, no stock market regulation, and to make matters worse, on top of all that, you had a farm sector that was depressed since the 1920s. So farmers were unable to help lift the country out of the Depression. They had been in their own depression since the 1920s. So the confetti bursts, and we now see Hoover's innovative failures. So what we remember Hoover for was doing a lot of things that you see on this slide, but none of these things could make a dent in the Depression because it was such a vast depression. He wanted businesses to voluntarily agree to keep production and prices high. Well, you can't voluntarily agree to save the economy. You need regulatory help. And by 1932, Hoover did sponsor the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and you see it invested a lot of money into the economy. At least for the times, it was a lot of money. $500 million in loans, $2 billion in loans later on, but only to the large corporate interests. And of course, that's a Hamiltonian program that made it seem that Hoover was only concerned about the rich rather than the poor. And it didn't help the jobless at all. It didn't help the farmers at all. It didn't help huge parts of the economy. More confetti. Well, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation changed again in 1932. Hoover changed it to allow for relief payments to the states, not directly to the poor, but relief allotments to the states that would then distribute it in the form of food baskets to the poor. The problem with that is that it wasn't enough money to meet the needs of the poor. There were loans provided for public works to the tune of $1.5 billion, but only $300 million in loans to the states for relief for the poor. And this money would have to be paid back by the states. No state could request more than $50 million, and there were 48 states, and every state had more than $50 million in loan, or in need, I should say. Some states had many times that. So this was just too little and too late. In the summer of 1932, you have the Bonus March. Now, the significance of the Bonus March is primarily political. It was not a major event in terms of the economy, but it made Hoover seem to be heartless towards the poor, especially the suffering war veterans from World War I. And this, more than anything else, caused his defeat in the election of 1932 and the election of Franklin Roosevelt, who was, of course, the leader of the New Deal. The Bonus March goes back to the Adjusted Service Compensation Act of 1924, which promised the veterans payment, a bonus payment for their service in the Army during World War I. But the money would not be paid out until 1945, or when the veteran died as an insurance payment to his family. This was very frustrating during the Depression, when veterans needed the money immediately. So veterans marched on Washington in a demonstration, in a protest, and tried to get Congress to pay the bonus immediately. But Hoover and the Senate opposed it, and it went down to defeat. Well, a lot of veterans had nowhere else to go. They were penniless, so they stayed around in Washington in a tent city in Anacostia Flats, Maryland. Hoover lost his nerve and ordered the Army to move the veterans out peacefully and as humanely as possible, but in the course of moving them out, there was a great deal of destruction. Nobody died, not from the moving of them out, but the scenes of the tent city being destroyed by American tanks and Army officers moving against other veterans of the First World War made Hoover seem heartless. So he had no chance to win in the following election. Douglas MacArthur was the general who exceeded his orders and destroyed the tent city, but Hoover took the blame. And as I said, Hoover's chances for re-election success ended right there. Now, FDR inspired confidence with image and style. There was a tremendous contrast between FDR and Hoover, just in terms of appearance. Hoover was dour. He was solemn. He couldn't make a speech if his life depended on it. But FDR was smiling and warm and encouraging, and his speeches were uplifting. And so, but of course, that's just style. That doesn't tell us anything about the New Deal. But Hoover's program was changed in three ways. Roosevelt required businesses to cooperate, and he added reform programs to prevent future depressions, and he added relief programs to inspire confidence in the democratic way of life. So you have these three R's to the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. And this was money that would not have to be paid back by the states. And so it was going farther than Hoover, and politically it was a winner. But in terms of lifting the country out of the Depression, it had very little more success than Hoover's program did. And it created the broker state government we have now. That is, the New Deal created a government that would help bank depositors, workers, farmers, middle-class Americans, and the historically oppressed. And by that I mean blacks, immigrants, and Native Americans. Never before had the government doled out assistance to all five groups. Before, the government either did nothing or it confined its assistance to the rich, the corporations. Now, in your flipped classroom session, your job is to play the role of a historian of either the New Deal for the jobless, the New Deal for the middle class, the New Deal for business, or the New Deal for the historically oppressed. And the question you're going to have to answer is, for your group, was the New Deal a truly New Deal, an old deal, the same old deal as before, or a raw deal? And you'll have to identify the facts that tell you so, not just from this show, but from the readings. And in the next video, part 2 of this video, we will look at the New Deal in detail, and we will raise questions for each of your groups that will help you explore answers to them.